The Labour Party supports these bills. I accept what the Minister says, that these suite of bills are probably the largest work program that the government has had running, and I congratulate the Minister of Justice for that. It does cause me to reflect, though, that at a time when New Zealand's economy is in an economic malaise, when the promises upon which the government were elected of closing the wage gap with Australia are causing a step change in the New Zealand economy and to lead us towards a brighter future are not being met, the largest work program that the government can show after 2.5 going on 3 years in government relates to the regulation of financial markets. And I think that perhaps highlights the fact that the government has lacked a overall credible plan for the development of the New Zealand economy. Now, I'm not denying the importance of financial markets. I'm not denying the need to tidy up the regulation of financial markets, particularly given the failures of finance companies in particular that were effectively allowed to get away with poor practice for too long and caused innocent investors to make unwise investment decisions, in part because they were not properly informed about the risks that they were taking, and in part because there was no insufficient regulatory oversight of poor practice, related party transactions for the benefits of some of the owners of those finance companies, and a number of other misdeeds, including, I am sad to say, by people who had prior form in earlier incarnations who the regulators should have had an eye out for. So no denying that there was a need for regulatory reform, but the more pressing issues that face the economy are how to grow it. And whilst I'm happy with the most of the detail of these particular instruments to improve the regulation of our financial market, I've got no confidence that this is going to make a material difference to the growth in the New Zealand economy. It doesn't make much difference to the growth in new exports that our country so desperately needs. It doesn't produce many more jobs. There might be the occasional extra job in the government service, but that's hardly the sort of outcome that the government has said that it wanted to be judged upon. So, Mr. Speaker, I think the fact that we are considering this large suite of bills under as described by the Minister as being the largest or one of the largest work programs of the government just highlights the fact that they haven't really had a credible plan in respect of the problems that the economy faces more generally. And I know that the government has had some problems as a consequence of the Christchurch earthquake, and those problems are not their fault. But it's not right to say that those problems from the Christchurch earthquake are the underlying source of most of the problems that the government faces. Those problems are of their own making, and the fact that those problems are not getting better in the way that was promised and are not getting better relative to how other countries in the world like the United States and the United Kingdom are performing, I think proves the point that the opposition has been making, that the government does not have a credible plan. The other, while we're talking about major things that the government has done, the other thing they say that they have done that has been big in their view is changes to the tax system. Well, those changes to the tax system, stripped bare, haven't really done much. Change to GST from income tax for low and middle income people is still effectively a tax upon their labour. They earn their money through their wages and their salaries, and they have to spend it when they go to the grocery store and they pay their money for their mortgage or for their clothes or for their rent. It's effectively a tax upon their earnings, a tax upon their labour. The only people for whom it makes a substantial difference, the switch from income tax to GST, are the very high income people who got a big income tax cut and don't pay as much extra GST as they got in their income tax cuts. So rather than it being a tax switch across the board, it really has only been a change from a tax upon income to a tax upon consumption for the very highest earners in a material way, because they, of course, got more tax cuts than they're going to incur in extra GST costs. So stripped bare, the effect of the tax changes by the national government was to increase the proportion of tax paid by low and middle income people and decrease the proportion of total taxes paid by higher income groups. And again, this brings us back to the theme that I was developing earlier, that in terms of economic plans, the government's plan has been too narrow. They have really a focus on income tax cuts rather than a broader suite of measures that are needed to grow the economy. And that's one of the things that the Labor Party says is different about our policies compared with theirs. We see that economic policy is broader than tax policy. We see that economic policy is broader than tax policy. There's been a real failure of leadership in respect of savings. I didn't see Sir Roger Douglas in the House, a leader on New Zealand's savings policy going back to the Kirk years. He knows that New Zealand needs deeper capital markets to improve the productivity of our output. And actually financial markets do touch upon that. And so I concede to the Minister that these instruments do, to the extent that they improve public confidence in capital markets, make a small difference to the depth of our capital markets. But not nearly as big a change to the depth of capital markets as a decent savings policy would have. And of course the government inherited, they criticise us for, the prior Labor government for overseeing an increase in private debt at a time when private debt was rising around the Western world. New Zealand wasn't immune from that affliction. We as a government pushed against that in three ways. We contributed to long-term public savings through what's colloquially called the Cullen Fund to save for future superannuation and to make that sustainable. We ran surpluses, every one of which was opposed by the government, the opposition now in government, who said that we should have had tax cuts that would have further fuelled property bubbles and private debt levels. And the third thing we did was introduce KiwiSaver, which of course the government undermined as soon as it got into government. So I find it surprising that in respect of this absence of adequate political leadership on economic matters, that the government's now saying the focus of this year's budget will be to improve savings and investment in New Zealand, when for the first 2 years they virtually ignored it, belatedly set up a advisory group, despite the fact that they'd had 9 years in opposition to plan a decent bit of policy around savings. After 2 years in government, they found that they were being criticised for their absence of vision when it came to adequacy of capital markets in New Zealand and thin savings compared with Australia, and belatedly set up an advisory group to tell them some of the things they might consider. They took a lot of the things that needed to be considered off the agenda and effectively forced that committee to work with one hand tied behind its back, so it's not as fulsome a report or as balanced a report as it might have been. And again, it shows that the government has been bereft of an adequate vision for our government, and we see this reflected in the fact that we've got vastly higher unemployment than they inherited. The gap with Australian wages continues to grow ever larger, and the promised step change in the economy has yet to occur. And in fact, if we haven't been in recession again, a double-dip recession just now, it's so close as to be, to be that reality, particularly given that some of the more negative records were in an office in Christchurch that the Statistics Department couldn't access. So, Mr. Speaker, whilst these bills will be favoured by us, I think we said yesterday that in respect of some of the securities changes, we would have preferred to see them delayed as to third reading, because we think that there is an argument that we need to wait on one of the other documents that the Ministry is working on, upon which we are to expect public comment, and we're concerned that whilst it was necessary to improve the regulation of finance companies and the like, we are worried that we're at risk of over-regulating private capital raising by small corporates who are trying to raise money for expansion. For example, an innovative firm setting up that wants to embark upon exports ought not to be prevented from effectively accessing retail equity markets for equity investments into their companies by overly prescriptive and overly expensive to comply with rules and regulations relating to prospectuses and the accounting rules that refer them, that apply under them. Mr. Speaker, in terms of further work that needs to be done, I have a view that the financial accounting standards and reporting standards have become far too complex in New Zealand. They've become so complex that most people, even if they're a experienced business person, can't understand them, and they need professional advice to properly read them, or they need to take an hour or two to read what ought to be able to be digested in half an hour. That needs to be fixed. Help is on the way, says the Minister. Well, that's good, because I am a little tired of some of the accounting fraternity saying we must have lower compliance costs when their cause of greater increase in compliance costs and on accounting standards and in respect of audit rules than is the case for many other sectors of compliance costs. So I would like to see some progress made in respect of that area, because it is absolutely fundamental to the growth of those new export sectors, and I'm not talking about the expansion so much of existing export sectors like the agricultural sector, important though those are. I'm worried that New Zealand have a hindrance, an unnecessary hindrance upon the ability of small, innovative businesses to grow as they try to expand into export markets through the compliance costs and impediments put upon their capital raisings when they're trying to raise funds for the next stage of expansion. And I think that most New Zealanders would rather go back to a period where we had some rather simple descriptions of the risks that they were facing when they were investing in those sorts of investments. The most they can lose is the amount of their investment, obviously. They need to have a fair description of the risks that are set out for them. More often than not, the financial projections of those high-risk early venture companies are effectively bereft of detail anyway, because it's so high risk they don't really know what they're going to be able to achieve. And if people are willing to invest upon that basis, and I know that people are on occasions willing to support those nascent enterprises, then we should be helping that happen rather than putting too many roadblocks in the way. We can't avoid all risk for people so long as risk is appropriately described. We ought not to overlay that with lots of mumbo-jumbo that we currently do. These documents I was shown recently by a mentor of mine the prospectus for the floating of Radio Otago Limited, which eventually became a very big public company, and it was effectively a 5-page document which described what was proposed, what the risks were. The financial projections were very, very simple but could be understood by people. We know that the complexity of some of the rules relating to financial disclosures now have become were both incomprehensible for people, but they didn't protect us from the greed and the poor behaviour of the big financial institutions who were the cause of most of the problems anyway. It's not been the little person trying to raise $500,000 to expand a small company that's been the cause of the big losses in the international arena. It's actually been complex derivative transactions that have been promulgated by the biggest banks and insurance companies in the world. So, Mr. Speaker, whilst these bills are supported by the government, in respect of some of the securities changes, as we said, we would have preferred that to be put on the back burner for a little while in order to wait for this other disclosure discussion document to be commented upon. But we do congratulate the Minister for a lot of hard work. The Select Committee, I know, I was only in it at the end, and so I'm not claiming credit for this, but I know that the Select Committee members put a lot of work. Submitters, including the professional societies of the accountants and the Law Society, put in a lot of work in their submissions to help the country have better legislation, and I think that in the end we've got to a reasonable result that everyone can take a bit of credit from. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party supports these bills.